John Basilone, who held off thousands of enemy troops with a single machine gun, to Guy Gabaldon, who made hundreds of Japanese soldiers to surrender, to Chesty Puller, whose battlefield ferocity became legendary, we break down the fiercest warriors of the Pacific War. But none are more mysterious than the lone scout said to leave, a single black pebble behind, causing enemy platoons to run away in fear. John Basilone, on the night of October 24, 1942, on a ridge above Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, one Marine sergeant, became the reason an entire Japanese regiment failed to break the American line. His name was John Basilone, and the men who served beside him called him Manila John. When the Imperial Japanese Army threw a sustained assault at the U.S. perimeter that night, Basilone was running, two sections of machine guns and the position in front of him, filled with attacking infantry hour after hour. He kept the guns firing, moved between them as crews were killed and wounded, and held a gap that, had it opened, could have let the Japanese pour through toward the airfield that the entire campaign was being fought over. By the time the assault burned out, the bodies in front of his guns were stacked in piles, and the line had held. For that night's work, Basilone received the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration the United States gives. The citation describes a man who kept his guns in action against a tremendous assault, who repaired and remanned weapons, and who pushed back through hostile lines to bring up desperately needed ammunition for his gunners while the fighting was still raging around him. The numbers attached to that night have grown in the retelling, but even the conservative accounts describe one man holding a position that should have required many. What made Basilone matter to the Japanese was not just the body count. It was what his stand represented. Guadalcanal was the first major American offensive of the Pacific War, and it was the place where Japan's assumption that Americans would crack under pressure collapsed. The Marines did not crack. They held a muddy airstrip through, repeated night assaults, disease and starvation rations, and men like Basilone were the reason. Basilone became famous enough that the United States pulled him off the front line and sent him home to sell war bonds, and he hated it. After Guadalcanal, the Marine Corps understood that they had a genuine hero, and a working class one at that, the son of Italian immigrants from New Jersey, a former soldier, who had served in the Philippines, which is where the nickname Manila John came from. The kind of man the American public could rally behind. He toured the country, his face on posters, raising money for the war effort. By every measure of self-preservation, he had earned the right to sit out the rest of the war as a celebrity. He refused. Basilone repeatedly requested to return to the fleet and to combat, turning down a commission and a stateside instructor's posting because he wanted to be back with Marines who were still fighting. The Arlington National Cemetery record of his life notes a man who could have lived out the war safely and instead insisted on going back into it. That decision is what turns a hero into a legend, and it is also what killed him. The Japanese did not fear. One lucky night on a ridge, they faced an enemy whose best fighters volunteered to come back for more again and again. When nothing was forcing them to, that willingness, the refusal to stay safe, was exactly the quality Japan had been certain Americans lacked. On the first day of the battle for Iwo Jima, February 19, 1945, John Basilone was killed leading men forward across the black volcanic sand, and he was still moving toward the enemy when he died. Basilone went ashore with the assault. Waves on Iwo Jima, one of the most heavily fortified islands the Marines would ever attack on that opening day, under fire. On the beach, he led a machine gun section against Japanese strongpoints, worked his way around a blockhouse that was holding up the advance, and helped guide a tank through a minefield while exposed to enemy fire. He was killed by Japanese mortar or artillery fire along with several of the men near him for his actions on that beach. He was awarded the Navy Cross posthumously, the only enlisted Marine of World War II to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. He had survived the worst night of Guadalcanal, gone home a celebrity, and chosen to die on a beach he never had to set foot on. That arc is why Basilone leads this list. He embodies the exact thing that turned Japanese contempt into dread: an ordinary American who would hold an impossible position, refuse the safe exit, and walk back into the fire until it finally took him to the men trying to stop the Marines. That was not a soldier they could intimidate. That was something closer to the demon their own propaganda warned them about. But not every feared American fought with a gun in his hands. One of them walked into the enemy's caves carrying nothing but his voice. And what he did there was, in its own way, even harder for the Japanese to comprehend. Guy Gabaldon, during the battle for Saipan in 1944, an 18-year-old Marine walked into Japanese caves alone in the dark and talked the enemy into surrendering, and by the end, he had brought back well over 1,000 of them. Guy Gabaldon was a Mexican-American kid from East Los Angeles who had grown up partly partly with a Japanese-American family before the war, and from them he had learned enough conversational Japanese to make himself understood. When his unit landed on Saipan, Gabaldon started slipping out on his own, against orders at first, approaching caves and bunkers where Japanese soldiers and civilians were hiding, and calling out to them, telling them they would be treated well, that they would be fed, that surrender did not mean death. On his first solo outings, he brought back a handful of prisoners, then dozens. Then, in a single day, he is credited with persuading hundreds of soldiers and civilians to give themselves up at once, a haul so large that it strained belief among the men who saw the columns of prisoners walking in behind one teenage Marine. Across the campaign, his total reached an estimated 1,000 to 1,500, one of the largest numbers of prisoners ever taken by a single soldier. His fellow Marines gave him a nickname that stuck, the Pied Piper of Saipan. He had found a weapon that no rifle could match in that war, the simple, almost unthinkable act of convincing an enemy sworn to die that living was an option. What makes Gabaldon belong on a list of feared Americans is the code he was breaking. The Japanese military culture of the Pacific War was built around the idea that surrender was the deepest possible disgrace, that a soldier should die fighting or take his own life before allowing himself to be captured. This was the same mentality that produced Banzai charges and the near total destruction of island garrisons who fought to the last man rather than yield. It was the wall the Marines kept smashing into across the Pacific, and it cost both sides staggering numbers of dead. Gabaldon walked straight through that wall using nothing but language and nerve. Every prisoner he brought back was a man who had been told his entire life that capture was worse than death, and who chose Gabaldon's offer anyway. He understood something about psychological warfare that whole staffs of officers had missed, that the fear and exhaustion inside those caves could be turned, that an enemy could be unmade rather than only killed. That is a different kind of fear than Basilon's machine gun, but it is fear all the same. An enemy who can persuade your own soldiers and civilians to abandon the code you have built your war around is an enemy you cannot fully predict or control. And there is little more frightening on a battlefield than that. The military took years to fully reckon with what Gabaldon had done, and the debate over his exact numbers has never entirely stopped. But the core of the story holds. Gabaldon initially received the Silver Star for his actions on Saipan, later upgraded to the Navy Cross. Many felt then and now that the scale of what he accomplished, saving lives on both sides while removing more enemy combatants from the fight than most rifle squads, warranted the Medal of Honor, and the campaign on his behalf continued for decades. The disagreements tend to be about the precise figures, not about whether one teenage Marine genuinely emptied caves full of the enemy with his voice. His story later reached a wider audience through a film, and through renewed historical attention to the men whose contributions had been overlooked, partly because of who they were and where they came from. Gabaldon was not a general or a poster hero. He was a Chicano teenager doing something nobody had ordered and nobody quite believed. And that is exactly why he earns his place here. The Japanese feared the Marines who would never stop coming, but they also had reason to fear the one who would walk up unarmed in the dark, speak to them in their own language, and dismantle the will to fight that their entire system depended on. By the time the Pacific War was over, this next soldier had been awarded the Navy Cross 5 separate times, making him the most decorated Marine in the history of the Corps. Louis Chesty Puller. Chesty Puller, named for his barrel-chested build, was already a hardened veteran of small wars in Haiti and Nicaragua before the Pacific, and he came into the island campaigns with a philosophy that could be summed up in one of his own demands to be sent where the fighting was worst. On Guadalcanal, he commanded a battalion that, in October 1942, held a thinly manned line against a far larger Japanese force during a night-long assault, directing the defense and calling in support while his men beat back wave after wave. That action earned him one of his Navy Crosses, but it was only one chapter. Puller led Marines through some of the hardest fighting of the war, including the brutal close-quarters slaughter of Peleliu, where his regiment took severe casualties grinding forward against fortified coral ridges. Through all of it, he built a reputation as a commander who led from the front and refused to spend his men's blood from a safe distance. The Japanese did not fear Puller the way they feared a machine gunner in their immediate path. They faced something arguably worse, a senior officer who would not be discouraged, who pressed the attack relentlessly, and who turned the Marines under him into a force that kept its aggression no matter how badly it was hurt. Puller's power was not in any single act, but in what he represented to the men he led, and through them, to the enemy they fought. Marines told stories about Chesty Puller the way other units told stories about battles. His bluntness, his contempt for comfort and paperwork, his insistence on sharing, his men's hardships, all of it made him the human embodiment of Marine aggression. A regiment that believed in its commander the way Puller's men believed. In him became miserably harder to stop, and that intangible quality translated directly into pressure on the Japanese defenders in front of them. This is the mechanism behind so much of the fear in this story. Individual heroes like Basilone could hold a line, mass capture artists like Gabaldon could empty a cave. But a leader like Puller multiplied the ferocity of everyone around him campaign after campaign, so that the enemy was not facing one frightening man, but an entire unit operating at the pitch he set. It is why he stands among the names the Japanese had reason to dread. Kill a machine gunner and you face the next one, but you cannot easily blunt a force whose commander has spent years teaching it never to stop coming forward. Puller survived the Pacific War, went on to fight in Korea, and became a living legend in the Marine Corps that outlived him by generations. Unlike Basilone, Puller came home from the Pacific and kept serving, adding to a record that already had no equal. His 5 Navy Crosses plus an Army Distinguished Service Cross, and a long list of other decorations made him a figure recruits still hear about in training today. The phrase, "the most decorated Marine," is not a marketing line. It is the literal tally of a man who repeatedly did things. The nation's second highest combat award exists to recognize, for the purposes of this list, what matters is the through line connecting him to the others. Puller was not feared as a one-night phenomenon. He was feared as a constant, a senior leader who showed up at the worst places in the Pacific again and again, and made the Marines under him deadlier every time. That consistency is the heart of why Japan's early contempt curdled into something like dread. It was not bad luck to run into one tenacious American. It was a pattern, embodied by men like Puller, that ran all the way up and down the Marine Corps. Leaders set the tempo, but someone still had to pry the enemy out of the rock by hand. And for that grim work, the Marines carried a weapon the Japanese dreaded above almost any other, wielded by men who knew it might be the last thing they ever did. Of all the weapons the Marines carried across the Pacific, none was dreaded by the Japanese or by the men who had to use it, quite like the flamethrower. The Japanese defensive strategy across the islands relied on a network of caves, bunkers, and pillboxes dug into coral and volcanic rock, positions so well protected that bullets and even artillery often could not reach the men inside. The American answer was the M2 flamethrower, a backpack tank of fuel and a wand that threw a stream of burning liquid directly into those openings. It was the tool that finally let the Marines pry fanatical defenders out of positions that nothing else could touch. For the defenders, it was a weapon of pure terror. A flamethrower did not just kill the men in a bunker. It consumed the oxygen, filled the space with fire, and left those nearby with the certain knowledge of how the men beside them had died. The psychological effect of seeing the flame teams advance, knowing what was coming if your position was the next one reached, was as devastating as the physical damage. The Japanese feared the demons who advanced through their fire to bring that weapon close, and the flame operators were the literal embodiment of that image. Men walking deliberately toward fortified positions, carrying fire on their backs. The terrible irony is that the flamethrower operator was often one of the most short-lived jobs on the battlefield. To use the weapon, an operator had to get close, within a few dozen yards of a position whose entire purpose was to kill anything that approached. He was burdened with heavy, conspicuous tanks that every enemy soldier in range understood to be the priority target. Some accounts of the fighting on Iwo Jima describe staggering casualty rates among flame operators, with the role being one of the deadliest a Marine could be handed. So the fear ran in both directions, which is part of what makes these men belong on the list. They were not feared because the job was safe for them. They were feared because they did it anyway. Every time a flame team moved up, the men carrying the tanks knew the odds, and they advanced into the worst of it regardless, because it was the only way to break the defense. That combination, a weapon of horror carried by men who accepted near-suicidal exposure to use it, is exactly the kind of relentless willingness that unmade Japan's early confidence. An enemy who sends men to do that, knowing what it costs, is an enemy whose resolve cannot be matched by simply defending harder. The flamethrower came to define the brutal, no-quarter character of the island, fighting more than almost any other image of the Pacific War. When people picture the savagery of Iwo Jima, Peleliu, and Okinawa, the Flame Team's burning out cave positions are often at the center of it. The weapon turned the campaigns into something closer to extermination than conventional battle, because the Japanese refusal to surrender meant that each fortified position frequently had to be destroyed with everyone inside it. The flamethrower was the instrument that made that grim arithmetic possible. This is also where the story starts to darken, where the fear in the title stops being clean heroism and becomes the mutual horror of a war with no quarter on either side. We will return to that later, because it is essential to understanding the whole picture rather than only the legend. For now, the Flame Operators stand on this list as a collective, not a single named hero, but a role that the Japanese had specific, vivid reason to dread, carried out by men who walked into fire so that the rest could advance. The Flame Teams cleared the fortified positions everyone could see. But there was another kind of American the Japanese feared precisely because they could never see him coming. Across every island in the Pacific, the Japanese learned to fear a category of American they could rarely see and almost never predict: the lone marksman and the small unit hunter, operating at the edges of the fight. The island battles were not only matters of massed assaults and machine gun lines. Much of the killing happened in the spaces between, in the jungle, the coral ridges, and the cave-pocked hillsides where individual Marines stalked, waited, and picked apart defenders one at a time. The same brutal terrain that the Japanese used to build their fortifications also created hunting ground for resourceful lone wolves who could operate independently, clearing positions and eliminating defenders in close, patient, deadly work. These were often young draftees and volunteers who arrived as ordinary men and were hardened fast by the conditions and by the enemy's tactics. Faced with faked surrenders, booby traps, and wounded soldiers who detonated grenades when approached, the Marines adapted into wary, ruthless fighters who trusted nothing and took few chances, and that adaptation made them far more dangerous than green troops ever could have been. The Japanese feared this because it removed the comfort of pattern. A banzai charge could be anticipated and met, but a marksman in the rocks or a small team working methodically along a ridgeline gave the defenders no way to know when or from where death would arrive. The fear these men generated came from the same source as their effectiveness. The hellish environment had forged them into something harder than they had started. The Pacific Islands were a nightmare of heat, disease, jungle, and coral that cut like a blade, conditions that ground men down physically even before the enemy entered the picture. Survival in that landscape against an opponent who would not surrender and who used the dead and wounded as bait demanded a level of vigilance and aggression that turned ordinary Americans into expert close-quarters killers. The transformation was a recurring theme in how the fighting was described afterward, by both the men who lived it and the enemy who faced it. That is the uncomfortable engine beneath this whole story. The Japanese tactics designed to make every yard of ground cost American lives also produced Americans who fought with a cold, adaptive savagery the Japanese had not anticipated. Each booby trap and false surrender taught the Marines to be more lethal, not more cautious. So the lone wolf earns a place here not as a single name but as a feared type. The unseen Marine who learned the island's rules faster than the men defending it and used those rules to take them apart. This category also points toward the darker truth waiting later in the story. In a war of no quarter, the line between feared hero and something harder to look at grew very thin. The same qualities that made these individual fighters so dreaded, their refusal to take risks with a surrendering enemy, their willingness to clear a position with extreme prejudice, were forged in a context of mutual brutality that neither side can claim clean hands in. The lone hunters of the Pacific were responding to real and lethal enemy deception, but the result was a style of fighting that left little room for mercy on either side. We will deal with that fully when the story reaches its reckoning. It would be dishonest to profile these men without acknowledging that the fear they inspired was inseparable from the horror of the war they were fighting. For now, what stands is this. Beyond the famous names, the Japanese had reason to dread the anonymous American in the rocks, the patient, hardened individual who had learned the island better than they had and who was waiting. These were the men at the tip of the spear, but none of them would have reached those beaches at all without the mind that built the spear itself, the American who made the impossible landings possible. If the Japanese feared the way the Marines came ashore, wave after wave, island after island, refusing to be stopped at the waterline, then they had one American more than any other to thank for it. Holland M. Smith earned the nickname Howlin' Mad for a temper that became legendary, but his real significance is in a title historians have given him: the father of modern amphibious warfare. In the years before the war, when amphibious assault was widely considered too costly to attempt against a defended shore, Smith was among those who pushed the doctrine, training, and equipment that would make it possible. The very capability that let the United States take back the Pacific one fortified island at a time. During the war, he commanded the V Amphibious Corps, directing the assaults on places like Tarawa and Saipan, the grinding, bloody landings that pierced Japan's island defensive ring. The men like Basilone and the Flame Operators were the tip of the spear, but Smith was a major architect of the spear itself. The Japanese had built their entire defensive strategy on the assumption that fortified islands could not be taken, or could be made so expensive to take that America would lose its nerve. Smith's amphibious doctrine is what proved that assumption wrong, again and again, and that made him one of the most consequential Americans they faced. Smith's aggression was not only directed at the enemy, and one of his decisions became one of the most bitter controversies in the American command. On Saipan in 1944, convinced that an Army division was advancing too slowly and endangering the operation, Smith relieved its commander, Army General Ralph Smith, of his command. The episode, remembered as the Smith versus Smith affair, became a lasting sore point between the Marines and the Army, a clash of cultures and tempos that historians still argue over. It captures the man precisely. He demanded relentless forward pressure and would burn any bridge to get it. That same uncompromising drive is what made the amphibious campaign work, and what made it so terrifying to defend against. Smith was not interested in cautious, methodical advances that gave the enemy time to recover. He wanted momentum maintained at almost any cost, and he built and led forces designed to deliver exactly that. For the Japanese defenders, this meant facing an opponent whose senior leadership was institutionally committed to never letting up. The fear the frontline Marines generated was, in part, a reflection of the philosophy that men like Holland Smith had baked into the entire force. Smith's legacy is the assault itself, the thing the Japanese could neither stop nor outlast. Every island landing that succeeded was a vindication of the doctrine Smith had championed before the war and commanded during it. The combination of naval gunfire, air support, specialized landing craft, and Marines trained specifically to cross a defended beach and keep moving was a genuine revolution in warfare, and it is the reason the island-hopping strategy was even possible. For a list of feared Americans, Smith represents the structural fear, not a single dramatic act, but the design of the machine that kept arriving on Japanese shores. The defenders could inflict appalling casualties, and they did, but they could not make the landings stop coming. And that was Smith's doing as much as anyone's. He stands here as the mind behind the method, the American who ensured that no matter how well an island was fortified, the Marines would find a way onto it. Lt. Gen. Roy Geiger. While other commanders became household names, one Marine general quietly led more major Pacific operations than almost any of them, and earned a reputation among those who knew the war for sheer unglamorous competence. Roy S. Geiger began his career as a Marine aviator, one of the early pioneers of Marine air power, and then did something unusual. He transitioned into senior ground command and excelled there too. Over the course of the war, he led forces through a remarkable string of campaigns: Bougainville, Guam, Peleliu, and Okinawa, giving him one of the deepest combat command records of any high-ranking Marine in the theater. He was not a self-promoter in the mold of more famous figures. Geiger's reputation rested on results. He was the steady professional who could be handed a difficult operation and trusted to execute it, which is part of why he was repeatedly placed in command of them. At Okinawa, after the death of the Army commander, Geiger briefly took over the entire 10th Army, a Marine commanding a primarily Army force, a rare distinction that spoke to how highly his abilities were regarded. The Japanese, facing operation after operation across the Pacific, were in effect facing Geiger's competence over and over without ever knowing his name. He was the kind of opponent who simply kept getting the job done in the most difficult circumstances the war could produce. Geiger's value lay in versatility, the ability to master both the air and the ground war, which made the American war machine harder to counter. Most senior officers specialized. Geiger's unusual path through both Marine aviation and ground command gave him an integrated understanding of how the pieces of an amphibious campaign fit together, how air power, naval support, and infantry assault had to be coordinated to crack a defended island. That breadth made him exceptionally effective at the combined arms approach that overwhelmed Japanese defenders. This points to a larger reason the Japanese came to dread the American forces. The United States kept fielding leaders who could weave its enormous material advantages into a single coordinated blow. It was not enough to have more planes, ships, and guns. Someone had to orchestrate them, and men like Geiger did exactly that, campaign after campaign. So Geiger belongs on this list as the embodiment of the professional the enemy could not rattle. Not a flamboyant legend, but the reliable hand who turned American resources into Japanese defeats from one end of the Pacific to the other. His record stands as a quiet rebuke to the idea that the Pacific was won only by famous names and dramatic last stands. For every Basilone holding a ridge or Gabaldon emptying a cave, there had to be commanders capable of directing entire divisions and corps through hell and out the other side. Geiger was among the best of them, and the breadth of his operations, more major campaigns than most of his peers, is a measure of how much the war effort leaned on his steadiness. The fear he represents is the fear of competence at scale, an enemy whose leadership was not only brave, but genuinely good at the brutal, complex work of taking islands. That is a harder thing to face than individual heroism, because it cannot be stopped by killing one man. Geiger is here, then, as the professional's professional. The American general the Japanese kept running into and kept losing to across the widest span of the Pacific War. Maj Gen Harry Schmidt, the man who commanded the largest all-marine battle in history, was so understated that he became known as the Quiet Marine, and the Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima was almost entirely destroyed under his direction. Harry Schmidt did not have the temper of Holland Smith or the press attention of MacArthur, but his combat resume in the Pacific was formidable. He led the 4th Marine Division through the assaults on the Marshall Islands and on Saipan, hard-fought landings that pierced the inner ring of Japan's island defenses before rising to command the Amphibious Corps. It was in that role that he took charge of the operation that would define him. At Iwo Jima in February and March of 1945, Schmidt commanded the assault force in what became the largest Marine Corps battle ever fought. 3 Marine divisions thrown against an island honeycombed with tunnels, bunkers, and hidden guns, defended by a garrison ordered to fight to the death. Under his direction, the Marines ground their way across the volcanic rock against fortifications that had been prepared for months, clearing them one position at a time at a cost that shocked even a public hardened to war news. The result was the near total destruction of the Japanese garrison, nearly all of whom died rather than surrender. Schmidt's quiet manner concealed a commander capable of directing one of the most ferocious and unrelenting assaults of the entire war, and the men trying to hold that island faced the full weight of his methodical, inexorable advance. Iwo Jima was not a battle of maneuver. It was a battle of attrition against fortifications, and Schmidt's task was to keep the pressure on no matter the cost. The island had been transformed by its defenders into one of the most heavily fortified positions of the war, with an interlocking network of caves and tunnels designed so that every American advance would be met by fire from multiple directions. There was no clever flanking move that could win it. It had to be taken yard by bloody yard, and that placed an enormous burden on the commander, who had to keep ordering men forward into it. Schmidt bore that burden through weeks of fighting in places the Marines named for what they cost: the meat grinder and the gorges where the defense made its last stands. This is where the broader brutality of the Pacific comes into sharpest focus, and where a commander's role becomes genuinely agonizing. Schmidt had to weigh the lives of his Marines against the necessity of taking the island, and he kept the assault moving when stopping was not an option, and every advance was paid for in blood. It was the kind of decision-making that wins wars and haunts the men who have to do it. For the Japanese, Schmidt represented the terrible certainty of the American method, an enemy who would absorb staggering losses and keep coming, who would not be deterred by the cost of the defense, and who would not stop until the island was taken and its defenders were gone. That certainty, the refusal to be bled into retreat, was perhaps the most frightening quality of all. Schmidt's quiet effectiveness is a reminder that the fear the Japanese felt was not only of wild aggression, but of cold, competent, unstoppable resolve. It would be easy to imagine that the Americans the Japanese feared were all fire and fury, the screaming charge, the machine gunner, the flame team. But Schmidt embodies a different and perhaps deeper source of dread, the calm, organized commander who executes a brutal assault with professional precision and does not lose his nerve when the casualties mount. There was no rattling a man like that, no breaking his will through the sheer cost of the defense. The Japanese defensive doctrine on islands like Iwo Jima was built explicitly on the hope that enough American casualties would erode American resolve, that the price of victory could be made too high to pay. Schmidt's command of Iwo Jima is the refutation of that hope. The price was indeed horrific, and the Marines paid it and the island fell. That is why the quiet Marine belongs among the feared. He proved that even when the Japanese made the cost exactly as terrible as they intended, the American command would absorb it and finish the job. An enemy you cannot outbleed is an enemy you cannot beat. And Schmidt demonstrated that truth on the worst island of them all. LT Gen, Alexander Vandegrift. Before the Japanese could fear the Marines had to prove they could win. And the man who proved it held a muddy airfield on Guadalcanal against everything Japan could throw at it. Alexander Vandegrift commanded the 1st Marine Division when it landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, in the first major American ground offensive of the entire Pacific War. His Marines seized a half-finished Japanese airstrip, the field they would name Henderson Field, and then had to hold it, cut off and undersupplied, against repeated Japanese attempts to retake it by land, sea, and air over months of grinding combat. It was on Vandegrift's watch, and under his command, that men like Basilone made their stands. The division held the perimeter through naval bombardment, night assaults, disease, and dwindling rations. In a campaign that hung in the balance for weeks, when it was over, the Japanese had suffered a strategic defeat that historians regard as the turning point of the Pacific War. The moment the tide began to shift away from Japan for good, Vandegrift's achievement was foundational. Every later legend of Marine ferocity rested on the fact that, at Guadalcanal, the Marines had stood and won when the outcome was genuinely in doubt. He gave the Corps its first great victory of the war, and he gave the Japanese their first hard proof that the Americans they had dismissed would not break. Vandegrift's deeper contribution was the cadre of leaders he forged in that crucible, a group whose influence shaped the rest of the war. Guadalcanal did not just produce a victory, it produced a generation of combat-tested Marine commanders. The officers who came through that campaign under Vandegrift formed what some have called the Guadalcanal Clique, a network of proven leaders who went on to command across the Pacific, carrying forward the hard lessons learned in those first desperate months. Vandegrift himself rose to become Commandant of the Marine Corps, shaping the institution from the top. This is how the fear compounded over time. The victory at Guadalcanal was not an isolated event. It was a school, and the men it graduated spread its lessons throughout the Corps. The relentlessness that defined the Marines for the rest of the war was, in significant part, distilled from the experience Vandegrift's division survived and won. So the Japanese, facing Marine units across the later campaigns, were in a real sense facing the descendants of Guadalcanal, the tactical and cultural inheritance of the men who had held Henderson Field. Vandegrift was the commander at the headwaters of that tradition, which is why he belongs among the most consequential Americans Japan ever faced. Guadalcanal shattered the assumption on which Japan had built its early war, and that psychological reversal may be Vandegrift's most lasting legacy. Japan had entered the war confident that Americans were too soft, too materialistic, and too lacking in warrior spirit to endure a hard fight, a belief reinforced by the stunning early successes that followed Pearl Harbor. Guadalcanal was where that belief died. The Marines did not behave like soft men. They held an impossible position through months of misery and beat back everything the Japanese sent against them. The shift in Japanese perception that followed, from contempt toward Americans to a wary, growing dread of the Marines in particular, has its origin on that island. Under Vandegrift's command, it is the hinge on which this entire story turns. Before Guadalcanal, the title of this video would have struck the Japanese high command as absurd. After it, the fear was real and earned. Vandegrift stands here, then, as the man who made the fear possible. He commanded the victory that proved the Americans would fight and win, and in doing so, he opened the door for every feared name that came after him. A.D.M. Chester, W. Nimitz, the Japanese feared individual Marines on the beaches, but there was an American mind that defeated them across the entire ocean. And he did it from a desk in Hawaii. With the help of broken codes and ice-cold judgment, Chester W. Nimitz took command of the Pacific Fleet in the darkest possible moment, days after Pearl Harbor had left American naval power in the Pacific shattered. As Commander-in-Chief Pacific CINSPAC, he inherited a catastrophe and was tasked with turning it around. What he did with that responsibility makes him one of the most important architects of Japan's defeat. Nimitz's defining moment came at Midway in June 1942. Armed with intelligence from codebreakers who had penetrated Japanese naval communications, he made the bold decision to ambush a far larger Japanese carrier force, gambling on incomplete information and the skill of his aviators. The result was a decisive American victory that sank 4 Japanese carriers and broke the back of Japan's naval offensive barely 6 months into the war, where the Marines fought the enemy at arm's length. Nimitz fought them across the whole theater, orchestrating the carriers, submarines, and amphibious forces that would systematically dismantle the Japanese Empire. The defenders dying on the islands were, in a sense, casualties of a strategy Nimitz was directing from above, the steady, relentless drive across the Central Pacific that he commanded. Nimitz's genius was temperamental as much as strategic, the calm to make enormous gambles and the wisdom to let his subordinates fight. Nimitz was not a flamboyant figure. His strength lay in a steady, collaborative leadership style. He trusted his commanders, weighed risks soberly, and kept his composure under pressures that would have broken lesser men. That calm is what allowed him to make the audacious call at Midway, to commit his outnumbered carriers to an ambush on the strength of intelligence, when caution would have counseled holding back. The willingness to take a calculated, enormous risk, and then trust the men executing it, was the essence of his command. This style stood in deliberate contrast to the more personality-driven approach of other commanders, and it proved devastatingly effective. By empowering capable subordinates rather than micromanaging them, Nimitz could direct a war across an ocean of staggering size, coordinating operations thousands of miles apart into a single coherent strategy of advance. For the Japanese, this meant facing not just brave men on beaches, but a guiding intelligence that kept making the right strategic choices, closing the ring, cutting the supply lines, choosing which islands to take and which to bypass. That kind of opponent cannot be defeated by killing soldiers, however many. He has to be outthought, and Japan could not outthink him. Nimitz represents the strategic fear, the dread of an enemy who simply would not stop coming, on a scale no island defense could blunt. The island-hopping campaign that Nimitz directed across the Central Pacific was, from the Japanese perspective, a slow-motion catastrophe they could not halt. Each island lost brought American air and naval power closer to the home islands, and behind every assault was the strategic patience of a commander, who was methodically tightening the noose. The defenders could make individual islands cost dearly, but they could not stop the campaign itself. This is the highest level at which the fear in this story operates. Basilone could hold a ridge, Schmidt could take an island, but Nimitz orchestrated the entire advance that made those battles add up to a strategic defeat for Japan. He turned American industrial might and intelligence superiority. Their place on this list is secure precisely because of that. They were feared and valued by a war effort that simultaneously distrusted the very people doing the fearing and the valuing, and they served anyway, brilliantly, in both oceans, while their families waited behind the wire for them to come home. Audie Murphy, the most decorated American combat soldier of the entire war, was a Texas farm boy, so slight that recruiters kept turning him away, and by the end he had more medals than any soldier the country had ever produced. Audie Murphy made his name in Europe rather than the Pacific, but no accounting of the American soldiers the enemy learned to dread can leave him out, because he set the standard against which every other fighter's record is measured. Repeatedly rejected for being too young, too short, and too underweight, Murphy eventually talked his way into the army and then fought through some of the hardest campaigns of the European War, accumulating a list of decorations that would eventually include the Medal of Honor and nearly every other award the United States offered for valor. His defining moment came in early 1945, when, during a German assault, he climbed onto a burning tank destroyer and used its machine gun to hold off advancing enemy infantry and armor essentially alone, directing artillery by field telephone while exposed on a vehicle that could have exploded beneath him at any second. He held that position until the attack broke, then led a counterattack, an act of single-handed defiance that earned him the nation's highest honor, and made him a household name for the rest of his life. What links Murphy to the men of the Pacific is the archetype he perfected, the unremarkable American, dismissed and underestimated, who turned out to possess a capacity for combat that no enemy assessment had anticipated. Japan made exactly that mistake about Americans as a whole, and Murphy is the European theater proof of how badly that kind of underestimation could backfire. The same nation that produced him was producing Basilones and Gabaldons on the other side of the world. Murphy's later life revealed the cost behind the medals and gave the country one of its earliest honest glimpses of what combat did to the men who survived it. After the war, Murphy became a film star, often playing the kind of hero he had actually been, including portraying himself in the screen adaptation of his own war memoir. But behind the celebrity, he carried the wounds that the medals never showed. The sleeplessness, the nightmares, the hypervigilance that we would now recognize as the signature of combat trauma. To his lasting credit, Murphy spoke openly about these struggles at a time when such things were rarely discussed, urging the country to take seriously the toll borne by its veterans. That candor connects him back to the harder realities running underneath this entire story. The men who became legends for their ferocity in combat did not emerge from it unchanged, and Murphy was honest enough to say so publicly when most were not. The fearsome soldier and the haunted veteran were the same person, and he refused to let the country see only the first. He belongs on this list as the benchmark, the most decorated of them all, proof of what underestimated Americans were capable of, and an early unflinching witness to what that capability cost. The enemy feared the fighter. Murphy made sure his own country also remembered the man underneath. Beyond Basilone, there was an entire breed of American fighter the Japanese came to dread in the abstract before they ever met one in particular. The Marine behind the machine gun holding a line that was never supposed to hold. The defensive machine gun position was the backbone of how the Marines survived the Japanese night assaults and banzai charges that defined so much of the island fighting. When massed Japanese infantry came on in the dark, sometimes in human waves intended to overwhelm a position through sheer numbers and shock, it was the machine gunners who had to stay in place and keep firing, knowing that if their guns fell silent, the line behind them could collapse. Basilone became the most famous of them, but he was representative of a whole category of men doing the same lethal work across Guadalcanal and every island after it. The job demanded a specific and rare kind of nerve. A machine gunner could not maneuver away from danger. His value lay precisely in staying put and maintaining a base of fire while everything in the enemy's arsenal was directed at silencing him. The crews suffered horrific casualties because they were priority targets, and replacements had to step over the fallen to take their place at the gun. The result, in front of a well-served Marine machine gun position after a night assault, was the grim spectacle of stacked enemy dead that became one of the defining images of the Pacific War. For the Japanese, the machine gunner embodied the futility that their own tactics increasingly produced. The banzai charge was built on the belief that superior spirit could overcome superior firepower, that the willingness to die would break the enemy's will to resist. The Marine machine gunner was the living, firing refutation of that belief. The man who stayed at his gun and made the charge fail, again and again, until the doctrine that sent men into those guns was revealed as a path to nothing but death. These men turned the enemy's greatest tactical gamble into its most reliable form of self-destruction, and that is a fear all its own. There is something uniquely demoralizing about watching your most desperate, most committed tactic fail completely and repeatedly. The banzai charge was meant to be the trump card, the moment when Japanese fighting spirit overwhelmed American material superiority through sheer ferocity and willingness to sacrifice. Instead, time after time, the charges broke against the machine guns and left the attackers dead in heaps, having accomplished little beyond their own annihilation. The men working those guns made that outcome inevitable. This is the collective fear that underlies all the individual legends. The Japanese did not only fear specific famous Americans, they came to fear the implacable arithmetic that men like the Marine machine gunners enforced. The certainty that courage alone, unsupported by equivalent firepower, would simply be cut down. That realization, settling over the Japanese forces island by island, was as corrosive to morale as any single defeat. The machine gunners stand here, then, as the anonymous engine of the fear, not one man but a roll, repeated across every beach and ridge, that converted the enemy's bravest tactic into its most predictable slaughter. Basilone was their face, but there were many of them, and together they taught the Japanese that the line would hold. Here's the part of the story the legends usually leave out. The war that made these Americans feared was a war of mutual savagery, and the fear ran in both directions, fed by atrocity and propaganda on every side. The Pacific War was, by wide agreement, among the most brutal theaters of the entire conflict, and the brutality was not one-sided. The The fighting was shaped by a dynamic of mutual dehumanization, in which racial propaganda on both sides stripped the enemy of his humanity and made extremes of violence easier to commit. Japanese forces used tactics that horrified the Americans, feigning surrender to draw in their captors before detonating grenades, booby-trapping their own wounded and dead, executing prisoners. And these practices, encountered again and again, hardened the Marines into men who took few prisoners and trusted no surrender. The Americans, in turn, were not free of their own atrocities. Some U.S. soldiers and Marines collected battlefield trophies from Japanese dead, teeth, skulls, gold fillings, a practice grotesque enough that it became a public scandal when a magazine published a photograph of a young woman posing with a Japanese skull her sweetheart had mailed home. American commanders issued orders against such mutilation, and it was never official policy, but it happened, and its existence is part of the record. The no-quarter character of the fighting was a product of both sides feeding each other's worst instincts. The dehumanization was deliberately manufactured. Japanese media portrayed the Marines as barbarians recruited from prisons and asylums, men who supposedly had to commit a crime to enlist, and who ate the bodies of their enemies. Grotesque caricatures designed to convince Japanese soldiers that surrender meant a fate worse than death. This propaganda stiffened resistance in the short term, but it also helped produce the very fanaticism that got so many Japanese soldiers killed in hopeless last stands and futile charges. The cost of all this fell hardest on families, and not only the families of the men who fought and died on the islands. For the Americans, the war emptied small towns of their young men and sent telegrams to farmhouses and tenements across the country. John Basilone's family in New Jersey lost a son who had already come home a hero and chosen to go back. The families of the machine gunners and flame operators received the same notices, multiplied by the thousands, from islands most of them could not have found on a map. The Pacific cost the United States more than 100,000 dead, and behind every one of those numbers was a household that never fully recovered from the loss. But the most wrenching family story of the war against Japan belonged to the Japanese Americans, whose loyalty was answered with barbed wire. While the Nisei linguists of the Military Intelligence Service were translating captured documents and interrogating prisoners in the Pacific, and while the men of the 442nd were bleeding through the hardest fighting in Europe, their own parents, siblings, and children sat behind the fences of incarceration camps in the American interior, imprisoned by the very government their sons were dying for. Families were split between the battlefield and the camp, sons in uniform and fathers behind wire, all on the basis of ancestry alone. And on the Japanese side, entire garrisons were annihilated to the last man, leaving families across Japan with sons who simply never returned, and in many cases no remains and no grave. The fanaticism that the propaganda had bred meant that surrender was so rare that whole communities lost their young men completely, swallowed by islands thousands of miles from home. The war tore families apart on every shore it touched, and the grief did not distinguish between the feared and the fearful. In the decades that followed, the two nations that had torn each other apart in the Pacific became among the closest allies in the world, and the families on both sides found their way to something like peace. The transformation after 1945 was remarkable. The same Douglas MacArthur who had vowed to return and then taken an empire apart presided over the occupation of Japan, overseeing not a vengeful dismantling but a rebuilding, a process that helped turn a defeated enemy into a democratic partner. Within a generation, the United States and Japan had become firm allies, their economies and cultures deeply intertwined, the savagery of the islands giving way to a friendship that would have seemed impossible to the men dying on those beaches. The reconciliation reached down to the level of the men who had actually fought. American and Japanese veterans returned to islands like Iwo Jima in the years afterward, meeting as old men on the ground where they had once tried to kill each other, shaking hands, weeping, and honoring their shared dead together. Memorials now stand on those beaches dedicated to the fallen of both sides. The hatred that propaganda had so carefully manufactured did not survive the peace. In its place came a recognition between former enemies that they had been ordinary men caught in something larger than themselves. For the Japanese-American families, justice came slowly, but it came. Decades later, the United States formally acknowledged the injustice of the incarceration, issued an official apology, and made redress to those who had been imprisoned. The valor of the Nisei soldiers, once doubted, became a celebrated chapter of the nation's history, their record of service standing as undeniable testament to the loyalty their country had once questioned. The families that had been split between the battlefield and the camp lived to see their sacrifice honored at last. The Pacific War remains one of the defining conflicts of the modern age, and the men the Japanese feared the most are at the center of how it is remembered. John Basilone was a working-class kid from New Jersey who went back to the fight that killed him. Guy Gabaldon was a teenager from East Los Angeles who emptied caves with nothing but his voice. The Nisei linguists served a country that had imprisoned their families and helped win the war that freed them. The machine gunners and flame operators were draftees and volunteers who held lines and burned out bunkers across a string of islands whose names became legend. They were feared because they came back again and again and would not stop until it was over. Their stories endure today in documentaries, books, films like The Pacific, and the oral histories of the dwindling number of veterans still able to tell them. Public interest surges around the great anniversaries. When the nation looks back at Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima and Okinawa and remembers what was asked of an ordinary generation, the men who fought there have become part of the permanent memory of the country, told and retold for new audiences who were born long after the guns fell silent. What began with Japan's certainty that Americans were too soft to fight ended on the deck of a battleship in Tokyo Bay, with the Empire's surrender signed and the men who had proved that certainty wrong standing among the victors. The Americans the Japanese feared the most were the human edge of a force that simply would not be turned back.